Choir of Stars. This is Incoloris Patrol Ship Unrequited Hope, Vox Adept Garrett intoned, his voice calm but insistent. Requesting response. Please key the set if you cannot vocalize. Only static answered. An ever-present screech carried on the radio bands, distorted by the binary red stars of Incoloris. Garrett leaned closer to the receiver, his pale, sightless eyes gazing blankly across the bridge. Radiation exposure had long since stolen his vision, but his ears remained sharp. Still nothing. He keyed the Vox again. This is Unrequited Hope. Respond if able. Key the set if you cannot vocalize. The hiss of the red stars screamed in reply. Weaponseer Cassina, seated cross-legged with her boots propped on an adjacent cogitator console, glanced over the top of her data slate. She set aside a crumpled copy of the Trinovian Times and shifted her attention to the blonde Vox Adept, then to the viewport. Beyond the reinforced glass, a Mechanicus freighter drifted closer toward the planet, boxy and ancient in design. Cassina sat up, querying the bridge cogitator with a rapid burst of binaric. Request, ID ping, target vessel. Horlin, the helmsman, didn't look up. He was immersed in a data scroll of fuel consumption reports, until the query blurted across his screen. He blinked, frowned, then answered in plain Gothic. Nothing, it's not on the manifest. Cassina's eyes narrowed. She crossed to the viewport, watching the lumbering freighter slowly emerge from the ruby haze of the system's twin stars. Can you bring it up manually? Profile check? Not in our cogitator banks, Hurlan replied, shrugging. You'll need to go through Incoloris control. Cassina exhaled slowly. Imperial bureaucracy was bad enough, but on Incoloris it was a hell forged from red tape. A scribe's nightmare. She rubbed her temple. Wake the captain, she said. Civitas Piri Palace. Far below, within the grand halls of the Archmagos' palace in Civitas Pire, capital of Incoloris, ruby light filtered through towering windows. Though the stained glass was designed to screen out the crimson glare of the binary stars, the palace interior remained bathed in a soft, calming blue, an artificial serenity. Osric twisted a cap onto a pressure piston and slotted it into place with a dull clunk. Below him, the sockets were now filled, but above, the next 20 feet showed a long row of empty holes waiting for reinforcement struts. He let out a long sigh. Godric handed him another rod. Archmagos Pyrovox stood nearby, arms folded, watching with detached bemusement. The reinforced entry system was just one of 3 installations. He was having his primary command throne room refitted as a high-grade invasion bunker. Why he needed such a thing, he wasn't entirely sure, but with the 2 finest tech marines this side of Sarathar temporarily in system, it had seemed a good opportunity to indulge their enthusiastic engineering. The only real inconvenience was the incessant hammering and construction noise echoing through his sanctum. "What about water?" Pyrovox asked casually. Godric, handing over another piston casing, scratched at the base of his augmetic ear. "We're 600 feet above sea level. And Incoloris's oceans are several hundred kilometers away," he replied flatly. "It could take an ocean hitting it, don't worry," Osric added without looking up. Pyrovox chuckled. "All right, what about lava?" Godric grunted. The Archmagos had been doing this all morning, conjuring increasingly ludicrous disaster scenarios to test their designs. So far, he'd received nothing but confident assurances. The sharp clicking of heels echoed across the command center's stonecrete floor, precise, mechanical, and deliberate. Magos Cybernetica approached from the data sanctum. Pyrovox suppressed a groan but waited until she drew closer before acknowledging her presence. She halted beside the Archmagos, cast a glance down at Osric, still waist-deep in the access shaft, and spoke flatly. "A Mechanicus freighter has recently entered orbit." Pyrovox raised an eyebrow, staring at her expectantly, waiting for the punchline. When none came, he lifted a hand with a weary flourish. "And? Are congratulations in order? That's what freighters are supposed to do. What makes this one so special?" Magos Cybernetica narrowed her eyes slightly, more a recalibration than an expression. She had already transmitted a full data packet to the Archmagos, along with 2,434 other status updates in the past hour. As usual, he had ignored them. It is a Mechanicus ship under chapter authority. Its captain, one Enginseer Logi Superior of the 6th Metricum, is registered to the Iron Hands. Both Astartes looked up. Osric climbed out of the trench and moved aside as a servitor trundled past, sweeping the floor with mechanical diligence. "We have no ships charted to Incaloris sector space," Osric said. She handed him a data log. "Secutor Reliquari," he read aloud. "I know it. Its captain is diligent. Does he say why he is here?" The Mago Cybernetica shook her head, her mechadendrites twitching with restrained irritation. "By Imperial decree, we do not have legal power to board." Osric passed the chart to Godric, who scanned it quickly. "She's carrying goods to our homeworld," he caught himself, correcting with a moment's hesitation. "Medusa," he said, remembering they weren't officially Iron Hands anymore. "All the same," Osric continued, "we still retain Iron Hands clearance. We'll take our ship and check it out." Pyrovox looked from one Astartes to the other. He realized with creeping dread that he was about to be left alone. With her, a thought sparked. "You may need assistance, and I am Archmagos of this forge. I will come too." Mago Cybernetica turned to him sharply. "You have tasks here. The forge cannot function without the Archmagos' constant oversight." Pyrovox nodded with a weak smile. "Yes, I know. Whatever will you do without me?" Without waiting for a response, he reached out, grabbed both tech marines by the shoulders, and steered them toward the starport. The Mariship ignited its gravitic drives and began to lift from the immense loading dock, rising gently into the ochre haze of Incaloris's upper atmosphere. It was highly uncommon, almost unheard of, for a 900-foot-long Space Marine strike cruiser to land on a planetary surface. But then again, this was Incaloris, and the ship was the Mariship. Strike cruisers, and most ships of their size, were designed for orbital berths where gravity posed no obstacle. In fact, according to Archmagos Pyrovox's personal records, there were only 2 other known strike cruisers in Imperial service capable of even partial atmospheric descent. The Mariship, now under the command of Brother Godric, had not yet been assigned to an active company. The 5th company of the Void Revenants had yet to be officially formed, its founding only months away, with the first supplicant still undergoing selection. Once the ship had been called Ferris Chalice, a proud Iron Hands vessel, their first strike cruiser dispatched to the Maelstrom Reach. At the time, it was the only permanent Astartes warship stationed in the region. Because of this, it had been heavily modified by the Mechanicus to operate within the hazards of the Reach and the Arcana Inclusium. The hull had additional radiation shielding, rendering it ideal for Incaloris space, where the proximity of red stars created high ambient radiation. It shared certain architectural principles with the Karabath-class vessels of the Forge worlds. Rugged, layered, compartmentalized. Twin drives and a gravitic stabilizer had been added, along with arcane internal machinery Pyrovox himself admitted he still didn't fully understand. Archmagos Demia Voratrix, in her typical flair for the dramatic, had even added hollow projection systems, allowing the Mariship to disguise its silhouette or project decoy echoes to confuse enemy auspex. A fine trick against pirates, though it never fooled the orcs. The name Mariship had been given later by Wulfgar, in accordance with the Void Revenants' new naming conventions. It was half joke, half omen. Mare, in the Wirthan tongue, meant nightmare. The ship had a tendency to require near-constant repair, and its machine spirit had a reputation for unreliability. But it also struck fear in enemies. Its silhouette alone was known to unsettle foes, and it carried a few particularly diabolical Mechanicus weapon systems beneath its battered plating. Its ability to land had originally been a necessity, not luxury. In the early years of the Reach, troop transports were scarce, and many systems were so irradiated that shuttles needed excessive shielding, reducing their capacity by half. Thus, the Mariship had been designed to carry down entire expeditionary forces or colonists, descending like a black fortress onto burning ground. It could even latch onto asteroids and physically haul them for extraction, defense, or navigation. That was the kind of work the Reach demanded in those days. No doctrine, no backup, no glory. Just hard work and hovering on the edge of survival. The region had a wild frontier feel, a wild east, where scattered colonies clung to life and forge worlds hid behind plasteel walls and dwindling hope. Rich in resources, yes, but every hour spent mining was paid for in blood. It had been hard. Wulfgar, Pyrovox, Cognitron Feruvis, Sensorax Centauri, together they had pooled what they had to bring order to the Reach. And somehow, through iron fire and bitter diplomacy, they had succeeded. Mostly. A few wars here and there. What frontier ever escaped them? But it was NihtWyrtha and the rising power of the Arcana Inclusium that had shifted the rusted cog at last. Things were different now. Pyrovox watched as the ground shrank beneath the viewport. The dust of the loading gantries, the shining towers of Civitas Pyrae, all faded into mist and cloud. Things were safer, more ordered, and in his estimation, far less interesting. Civitas Pyrae began to shrink beneath them as the Meriship engaged its thrusters, rising into the crimson-tinged void. A dock horn sounded distantly. A moment later, a thin, transparent layer slid down over the viewport. Extra shielding, now that they had cleared the atmosphere and were exposed to the intense radiation that filled Incoloris space. Heavy bootfalls thudded down the deck. Osric approached, casting a glance out the side viewport. "We'll get that door finished when we get back," he assured the Archmagos, referring to the throne room reinforcement. Pyrovox nodded, taking a moment to ask something he'd meant to for some time. "How is your axe?" Osric drew the weapon from his back. It was a masterwork, the shaft embedded with a compact bolt gun, its blade perfectly balanced, pure Mechanicus craftsmanship. "It's good," he said. "Killed anyone I know with it?" Pyrovox asked with dry amusement. Osric shrugged. "Not that I know of, but we can check the reference logs later if you like." The sound of another pair of boots echoed, lighter. A chapter serf stepped into view, standing just within the threshold. His voice came with reverence, but was subdued, not the tone of a Skitarius who would have fallen to his knees before an Archmagos, but that of an Astartes-born servant. It was refreshing. "Lord Archmagos," he said. Pyrovox turned, responding with a short burst of binaric cant, ready to receive. "We've received an astropathic signal," the serf continued. "It's from NihtWyrtha. The Secutor Reliquary is en route to Calth, expected within a week." He paused, visibly uncomfortable with the next part. Osric glanced at Pyrovox, then extended a hand. "Consider the Archmagos one of the chapter," he said plainly. "Half the things we're bringing into the field come from here anyway." The serf bowed, though his displeasure remained. "Inquisitor Malinovska was aboard," he added. Osric froze, the name catching him off guard. "He's still in the Inclusium?" he said. "What was he doing?" The serf hesitated. "The images show him working with the Sothawirdas." That was unexpected. Osric dismissed him with a short burst of thanks in Binaric, then turned to the viewport, gears turning. "Did you know anything about this?" he asked the Magos. Pyrovox was caught off guard as well. "The Sothawirdas?" he echoed. "I assumed they were a joke at first, a tangle of rogue traders, whispermen and informers working for the NihtWyrthan monarchy. Hildolith restructured them before her death, and Prince Hieorwulf raised them to something approaching real imperial intelligence. But I didn't know they worked with an Inquisitor. And certainly not Gregor Malinovska. The Inquisitor had never mentioned such collaboration in their past meetings. And if he was entering Incoloris space, he would have typically asked Pyrovox for local intelligence access, standard procedure. But Pyrovox liked Malinovska. The man was a realist. In their last meeting, they'd worked side by side to dismantle a 5-tower cult clade that had infiltrated the ecclesiarchy on Incoloris. The cult hadn't initially been flagged as heretical, but its spread had been suspect. Malinovska had tried to keep it contained on Manifold Dawn, where it began. In fact, it was at Malinovska's urging that Preacher Tordik had been sent to NihtWyrtha to assist Deacon Absalon in suppressing the cult's rise within the Arcana Inclusium. And now he was aboard the Secutor Reliquary. That wasn't protocol, that was suspicious. Pyrovox suddenly felt uneasy. He glanced down at the world below. Incoloris, a forge he had come to as a lull of dreams and ambition. A world once ravaged by infighting, where a Drukhari raiding base had dug itself into the polar crust and struck daily with impunity, where Manufactura choked on inefficiency and half the population suffered from radiation sickness. But today, it was his, entirely, undisputed. Few died of radiation now. The hive cities were shielded. His ships sealed. Production flowed, efficient, secure, safe, and yet, it felt as though some poison had already been swallowed, only to realize, too late, that the antidote would come up short. Osric's voice broke the silence, tactical readouts flashing across his helm's visor. The Secutor Reliquary is being escorted by the patrol Carabath Unrequited Hope. Is it a reliable ship? Is its captain capable? Pyrovox blinked, forcing focus, and gave a mechanical twitch of the neck. No idea, he admitted. We have 15 patrol Carabath. They're solid vessels, heavily armored, but they're barely more than old system defense monitors from the early Reconquest. As for the captain, he hesitated, then added, we've never met. Bit below my station, I suppose. He looked faintly apologetic. Osric gave a short nod. He understood. The Incoloris defense fleet was mostly meritocratic, but some vessels, particularly older patrol craft, still ran on outdated VAT clone hierarchies, favoring number-born over true merit. But he also knew something else. Low-tier ships like Unrequited Hope were often crewed by real-born voidsmen, which usually meant more competence, less ceremony. Still, this was a gamble. Contact the Unrequited Hope, Osric ordered. Tell her captain we will dock with the Secutor Reliquary and board. She is to hold off and cover us. Pyrovox, with a subtle twitch of his eye lens, activated his new spheric interface, sending a tight beam encrypted data cant to the patrol ship. He couldn't help but note the absurdity of the command. How exactly was a Monitor-class patrol boat supposed to provide cover for a Space Marine strike cruiser? Osric stepped forward, pulling his axe from its mount. Prepare for boarding. Assume the worst, he said. Then we might be pleasantly surprised if it's just a drowned transmitter relay. Godric drew his power hammer with a low whine of activation. Around them, 4 Iron Hands brethren locked their bolters in place, ritual gestures giving way to efficient readiness. Pyrovox looked around the boarding chamber at the gathering of armored warriors. He found himself wishing, not for the first time, that he had brought his own axe. With a sigh, he shrugged and drew his Serpenta pistol instead. It would have to do. Aboard the Unrequited Hope, Engineer Tyros Kalin, captain of the patrol Carabath Unrequited Hope, was seated in his command dais. Calling it a command dais was generous. All Carabaths had a throne, little more than a metal chair with a new spheric uplink, a strip of picked feeds, and a bracket for interfacing. No grandeur, no ceremony, not even a proper cup holder. The Unrequited Hope was a patrol ship, not a vessel of war. Half of its compartments were dedicated to macro cannon and munitions. The other half were filled with winches, grav clamps, cargo space, and crates of replacement shielding for stranded craft. Kalin had 2 forward torpedo tubes and 4 macro cannons, though only 2 actually worked. One fired only sealant pods and flares. The 4th had been requisitioned for repair and never returned. Still, she was a Monitor-class hull, which meant a centerline spinal mounting. The broadside cannon could fire both port and starboard, unlike newer Carabaths with split decks. There was utility in her age. His throne, though plain, had relevance foam around the corners, a precaution to keep his blind Vox officer from injuring himself. That, and a servitor to hold his cup, a very practical solution. Tyros Kalin, like most Incolorans, was a pragmatist. Vox Adept Garrett hunched at his console. His blindness sharpened his ears, and 2 servitors flanked him, one rigged for enhanced auditory filtration, the other a scribe adept, ready to log transmissions. Again and again, Garrett sent hail bursts toward the freighter. Between attempts, he coordinated ship readiness reports, relaying them back to the captain without missing a beat. At the helm, Hiralan sat rigid, fingers twitching slightly above the control toggles. Any moment now, he'd be required to maneuver the Carabath. Slowly, yes, but with precision. The tension showed. Weaponseer Cassina had the biggest grin on the bridge. She was seated at her gunnery post, hands poised over the ancient weapon runes, and relished the order that had just come down. Cover the Mariskip. From the Archmagos himself, no less. 2 macro cannon, all hers. Tyros Kalin rubbed his chin as he watched the boarding arms extend from the Mariskip, linking with the freighter. In his gloved hand he held the printed Vox scroll from moments earlier. He didn't need to feel the embossed braille under his thumb to know what it said. It bore Pyrovox's personal engram. His ship had never received a personal message from the Archmagos before. According to the data packet, the Secutor Reliquary was meant to be en route to Calth. This was the opposite direction. Calth lay far beyond the Sarathar sector, past Castel, then through the Arcana Inclusium, and only then into the Incoloris Verge. Even a warp storm or engine malfunction couldn't have flung a ship this far off course. This was deliberate, and yet the freighter, for all its silence, remained under power. If it had ill intent, it could have lied, claimed distress, requested repairs, anything to lower suspicion. But it didn't. It said nothing. It invited boarding, or worse, perhaps there was no one aboard to answer. Kalen shook himself. His imagination was drifting too far. He took a sip from his cup, then placed it calmly into the hand of the servitor at his side, which accepted it within silence. Outside, the view was imposing. The Maris sheep was vast, even freighter-sized. From a distance, it could pass for a carabath with extra armor, but up close, it dwarfed the unrequited Hope. Her radiation shielding, rumored to have been fitted in Incoloris Grand Docks, gave her a pitted mechanical bulk that made her silhouette hard to read. Only one other ship in Incoloris could compare in mass, the carrier Divine Spirit. Kalen had once seen the skeletal remains of her unfinished sister ships hanging in the outer dock rings. Unlike the Mariskip, the Divine Spirit was round-bodied, almost shell-like. She carried hundreds of servitor-operated drones, each barely armored, hence the excessive shielding. A chime from Garrett drew his attention. A scroll extruded from a narrow slit in his throne. Kalen pulled it free. "All stations report readiness," it read. He gave a slow, grave nod. Then looked once more to the freighter. They were dangerously close now. If this continued, the Secutor Reliquary would breach atmospheric altitude, within planetary descent range of Incoloris itself. It would have to be taken under control. And soon. A knot of unease settled in his gut. Something wasn't right. He could see them, tiny figures, barely visible, moving slowly along the umbilical between the Marisip and the silent freighter. Tyros Kalen held his breath. He glanced sideways toward his Vox officer. Garrett was already looking at him. He did that sometimes, looked directly at people despite his blindness. It was disquieting, as if the radiation-scarred sockets still saw something others couldn't. His expression shifted, brows furrowing. There was concern. "Lord," Garrett murmured, "I'm picking something up. It's not on the feed and it has no waveform, but—" His burnt eyes twitched, scanning nothing. "I can hear it." Kalen leaned slightly toward him, an old reflex, even though he knew Garrett could hear him from across the ship. "On Voxcaster," he ordered. The bridge filled with a low hiss. The ambient radiation from Alpha and Beta Incoloris, the twin red stars, poured in like static-laced wind. Kalen was momentarily swept back to his cadet days, long night patrols in the outer system. His officer of the Dog Watch used to open the Voxcasters to the stellar bands, letting the stars speak to them. It became a comfort, listening to the twin suns whisper across the void while predators, pirates, and Drukhari hunted the night. But this was different. It was more than radiation screech. It had words. Cassina narrowed her eyes, turning a dial. "Did you get that?" she asked. A midshipman at the secondary Vox post hesitated. I did, Lord." It's like a hymn. Kalen felt a shudder crawl down his spine. He'd heard it too, just faintly. Whispers, layered, dissonant, like monks whispering a funeral dirge just beneath the scream of radiation. "Are we picking up a Ministorum channel?" he asked. Garrett shook his head slowly. His twin servitors mirrored the motion, eerily synchronized. "No, Lord," he said. "Ecclesiarchy don't use these upper bands." They listened. Outside, in the red-litten void, the figures continued across the umbilical, vanishing into the darkened hull of the Secutor Reliquary. Inside, time stretched. The radiation song of the twin suns twisted in the air. Then Garrett's eyes snapped open, wide. "Lord," he gasped, "that's Dark Mechanicum cant, thin band, masked in stellar static." He recoiled, his hands trembling across the consoles, searching, patting for shapes only he understood. "We're under scrap code attack," he shouted, panicking, slamming his palm down in the dark. Kalen's breath caught. He looked up, through the reinforced viewport, toward the freighter and the strike cruiser. His eyes widened. He reached for his personal Vox interface, too late. On board the Secutor Reliquary, Godric swore a quiet oath to the machine god that if he ever found the ship's captain, he would give them a firm shake of whatever augmetic post counted as a hand. Freighters were never this hard to breach. Mechanicus freighters could be tougher, yes, but your average engine seer adept was rarely a match for an Astartes tech marine. Godric had breached many, ore haulers dodging tithes, rogue traders offering trinkets and credits in exchange for forgetting a certain cargo bay or miscounting the number of uncertified weapon crates. He'd broken their firewalls in seconds and offered a kind smile at their feeble attempts to hide things behind low-tier encryption, sometimes even passwords. But the Secutor Reliquary? This was something else entirely. Whoever the Enginseer Logi Superior of the 6th Metricum was, they were either brilliant, mad, or both. Their digital defenses were layered, recursive, and frankly, diabolical. For the 6th time, Godric started again, adjusting his cogitation array. This time, he'd approach via the blessing code, replicating the access psalm using a looping harmonic cant. An obscure subroutine, rarely used but valid. It should work. Pyrovox watched the process with idle interest, then shifted his focus to his radiation meter. The umbilical they stood in wasn't well shielded, just a utilitarian cargo access tunnel reinforced with plasteel mesh and foil lining. It was good enough for short crossings, but not indefinitely. They had maybe 10 minutes before exposure became problematic. The 4 Iron Hands Astartes stood like statues, weapons ready. Osric stood at the lead, axe in hand, gazing out into the void. He turned slightly toward the Archmagos. "Think they can see us from the Unrequited Hope?" Pyrovox turned to look at the Karabath-class monitor in the near distance, sitting quietly with her weapons cold. "At this range," he replied, "without augmentation, we'd be nothing but a few gray pixels." Osric gave a short nod, then raised his arm and waved anyway. Pyrovox allowed a faint hum of amusement to escape from his rebreather grill. He returned his attention to the radiation readout. The glyphs flickered across the screen in orderly columns, numeric, vectorial, status symbols. Nothing anomalous, but still, something tugged at the edge of his awareness. A rhythm. He didn't hear it with his ears, not exactly, but with his auspex open, background filtering the stellar radiation from the twin incoloris stars, he sensed it. Not interference, not signal, cadence. Like a prayer barely audible, a filtered hymn carried beneath the screech of the void, so faint it might have been memory or echo or warning. He focused harder. The Vox registers were clean, no waveform, no transmission, and yet it was there, monks whispering to the void just under the threshold. He blinked, pulled back from the meter, and glanced again at the freighter's dark hull. Something wasn't right. Then Omnissiah be praised. Godric said as the hatch finally hissed and slid open with a pressurized gasp. Osric gave a low, satisfied grunt, the kind he gave before every breach. With axe at the ready, he stepped forward into the Secutor Reliquary. The others followed. The interior of the Secutor Reliquary was dim, lit only by the cold glow of residual lumen strips flickering along the upper curve of the gantry's arch. The boarding corridor yawned ahead, a cylindrical tunnel of layered steel ribs and retractable scaffolding, wide enough for freight hovers but now silent. Godric was first through, his servo-enhanced boots crunching over scattered fragments of plasteel debris, twisted support struts, shattered wiring conduits, and what looked like the blackened remains of a data servitor casing. He swept his bolt gun left, then right. Osric followed just behind, axe in hand, its energized edge hissing quietly in the stale air. The Iron Hands moved with practiced caution, forming a staggered advance. All around them the walls bore damage, not the heavy concussive burns of melta or crack grenades, but thin, precise scorches. Serpenta fire. Pyrovox spotted the telltale burn lines, tight groupings along bulkhead corners and the edges of door frames. Deliberate targeting. He placed one gloved hand on the wall and felt the slight warping of metal, the result of multiple low-yield strikes in rapid succession. Not suppression fire. Execution fire. Standard Serpenta marks, he said to himself. Pattern consistent with Mechanicus sidearms, guard mode. Guards shooting at what? Osric asked, his voice low. There was no answer. They passed through a partially melted blast door, its upper seal twisted open, like a mouth frozen in a scream. Beyond it, a secondary corridor branched to the left, but debris blocked the path. Collapsed piping, shredded mesh, scattered ritual tools, an incense censer, cracked open and leaking clotted ash, a bent cogwheel pendant, still faintly warm. Godric stepped over a servo claw, its fingers twitching spasmodically, the stump of its power feed severed and fused. No bodies, not a single corpse. Yet there had clearly been a firefight, a brief, brutal one. The precision of the strikes, the lingering ozone, The absence of return fire patterns all pointed to a massacre. Signs of a retreat? One of the Astartes behind Osric asked. No, said Pyrovox, scanning the wall glyphs. These shots were fired inward. They were defending. From deeper in the vessel, a low metallic groan echoed, some ancient bulkhead shifting, or perhaps something else. The iron hands advanced further into the ship, and the red star light behind them, from the open hatch to the umbilical, slowly faded. The next chamber opened with a sluggish hiss, air pressure groaning as aged hydraulics struggled against time. The door retracted partway before jamming, forcing Godric to drive his shoulder into it and wrench it aside with a grinding snarl of metal. They entered a maintenance junction, wide enough to hold multiple cargo manipulators, with ceiling-mounted rails and long disused lifting gear overhead. The smell struck them immediately: burnt oil, clotted blood, corrupted incense. The chamber was filled with bodies, 8 at least, all in varying states of ruin. Several wore the crimson and brass robes of low-ranked Mechanicus adepts, though their forms were no longer fully human. One had been torn limb from limb, its remains scattered across a shattered cogitator station. Another, closer to the center of the room, had clearly detonated from within, its ribs shattered outward in a halo of charred robes and blackened steel. Osric moved to one of the corpses that had fallen near a sealed hatch. The corpse's hands were twisted, clawed, and coiled with thick worm-like tendrils. The left arm ended in a snarling mouth-like orifice, ringed with cracked teeth. The metal of its augmetic housing split and fleshed with something organic. Veins pulsed beneath its chrome surface. A triobosis, Osric thought. A rare failure mode in Mechanicus hardware. Thought to be the result of corrupt code loops in memory helix drives. Self-replicating organic feedback, creating this. Mutation, Godric said, reading Osric's hesitation. Warp taint? Pyrovox leaned close, his optics adjusting. Worse, adaptive fusion. Machine and flesh responding to unsanctioned stimuli. Never seen it on this scale. It only spreads by direct contact. Easy to spot and deal with, but this is a full outbreak. Osric grunted, pulling his axe free. I wish we had Brother Nathaniel here. He'd know all about this. Behind them, one of the iron hands paused. Lord, he said quietly, do you hear that? They all froze. Silence. Then almost something beneath it. Voices, not spoken aloud, not audible in the normal sense. It was coming from their Vox receivers. Pyrovox tilted his head, augmetics twitching as he isolated audio bands. It wasn't Vox. Not exactly. It was below Vox, behind the static hum of the ship's failing power systems. A whisper, shaped like speech, but wrong. Like someone was trying to pray through a rusted machine's scream. We should not linger here, Osric said, voice low. Godric nodded, stepping back toward the far door. I agree. Last one out is cleaning everyone's armor. Behind them, a servitor's dismembered head twitched, its optical lens briefly flaring red before flickering out. Pyrovox raised his Sapina pistol without thinking, aiming at the twitching servitor head. He hesitated. He glanced sideways. All the Astartes had done the same, bolters leveled, eyes fixed. That made him feel slightly less foolish. Then came the sound. A clunk, like a dropped chain, echoed from the hatch leading to the next cargo hold. Pyrovox gently moved a bolter barrel aside and stepped forward, leaning just far enough to see through the half-open bulkhead. He felt tension release. There, standing in the gloom, his back turned, was the unmistakable figure of Inquisitor Gregor Malinovska. He appeared to be helping someone up, cradling a slumped form. The hold was crowded. Skitari, engine adepts, and crew, all standing in stillness, all facing the rear wall. Pyrovox stepped inside, his boot echoing louder than expected. Malinovska began to turn. Relieved, Pyrovox let out a dry chuckle and smiled. There you are, old friend. What in the Emperor's name are you doing? He stopped. Smile frozen. The figure turned fully. Malinovska's hands were no longer hands. They had unraveled into long, snake-like proboscises, coiled with needle teeth, twitching in anticipation. The body he'd been holding, what remained of the enginseer Lagi Superior of the 6th Metricum, was dropped like refuse. It hit the deck with a wet, metallic thud. Malinovska's cracked lips peeled back, and from his open mouth, another tongue serpent slithered forward, snapping toward Pyrovox. Osric moved. He reached for Pyrovox, hand outstretched, but his Vox screeched, the sound drilling into his skull. His armor shuddered. Another Astartes stepped forward, bolter raised. He stopped, he shook violently, then fell still. His helmet lenses dimmed, darkened, died, dead systems. Osric took another step, but his armor locked. He could hear the hiss of pistons sealing, joints freezing one by one. His visor filled with a flood of red glyphs, flickering error code cascading across the display. He recognized it instantly. Scrap code. "It's a trap," he growled, but his voice was cut off as his audio systems failed. Every limb seized. Status lights pulsed in a red strobe. Warnings overlaid one another in chaotic duplication. He tried to override the locks. Nothing. Then the screen went black. All power dead. He could no longer move, speak, or see. Even his air pump cut out. The subtle, ever-present hum of life support went silent. Osric was left breathing into darkness, entombed in his armor. His battle plate had become a sarcophagus,